The story of the Red Sea miracle is one of the most powerful and unforgettable moments ever recorded in the history of faith. It is a story that captures both the imagination and the heart, because it speaks of a God who hears the cries of his people and responds with unmatched power. Imagine standing at the edge of the sea with no escape in sight, only to watch as the waters divide and a path of freedom appears where there was none. This event has inspired countless generations because it represents more than a miraculous escape. It represents hope, deliverance, and the assurance that when all seems lost, God is still able to make a way. This miracle continues to resonate because it reflects the struggles we all face in life. There are moments when obstacles rise before us like towering seas, and when pressures press in behind us like Pharaoh's army. The Red Sea stands as a symbol of those impossible situations, yet the story reminds us that the God who acted then still acts now. He is the one who transforms despair into hope and impossibility into victory. For Israel, the crossing marked the end of slavery. But for every believer, it serves as a reminder that God leads his people out of bondage and into freedom. The awe of this moment is remembered in Psalm 77 verse 19, which says, "Your path led through the sea, your way through the mighty waters, though your footprints were not seen." This verse captures the mystery of God's hand at work, for he moves in ways we cannot always see, yet his deliverance becomes undeniable. The miracle of the sea is not only a story of the past, it is a testimony for today, declaring that his power is greater than every barrier, and his presence goes before his people, even when his footprints are hidden. The Red Sea miracle also reveals the heart of God's faithfulness. For centuries, the Israelites had lived under the weight of slavery, and their cries seemed unanswered. Yet in the perfect time, God revealed his power in such a way that no one could deny his sovereignty. Their deliverance was not only for their sake, but for the glory of his name. In the same way, the challenges we face today can become opportunities for his power to be revealed, showing that he still reigns over the storms and seas of life. As we journey through this story, we are invited to see more than a moment of history. We are called to enter into its meaning, to reflect on what it teaches about faith, freedom, and the God who makes a way when no way seems possible. The Red Sea miracle is not simply about what happened to Israel long ago. It is about what continues to happen when God intervenes in the lives of his people. It is a story that speaks into our fears, strengthens our faith, and reminds us that we are never alone when the sea stands before us. Before we continue deeper into this journey, I want to encourage you to stay connected. If you enjoy reflections like this and want to hear more inspiring stories from Scripture, make sure to subscribe to this channel. Your support helps spread these messages of hope. And by sharing this video with others, you can encourage someone else who may be facing their own Red Sea moment today. The story of the Red Sea miracle does not begin at the shore of the waters, but in the land of Egypt, where the people of Israel endured centuries of oppression. What had started generations earlier as a place of refuge during the famine in the time of Joseph had become a house of bondage. The Israelites had grown numerous, and their increasing strength stirred fear in the heart of Pharaoh, who viewed them as a threat rather than as neighbors. His fear turned into harsh decrees, and his decrees hardened into ruthless slavery. The Israelites were forced into grueling labor, building cities and toiling under the weight of a system designed to break their spirit. Their days were marked by exhaustion, and their nights by despair. The cries of the people rose from the fields and from the brickyards, echoing through the land of Egypt. These were not only cries of physical pain, but cries of souls, longing for freedom, longing for dignity, longing to be remembered by the God of their fathers. It seemed as though heaven was silent, and yet the scriptures remind us that God had not forgotten. Exodus chapter 2 verses 23 to 25 describes this moment, saying that the Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry went up to God, who heard, remembered his covenant, and was concerned for them. This passage reveals the deep truth that no cry of suffering is ignored by him, even when silence lingers for generations. Bondage does more than bind the body. It wearies the heart. The Israelites lived under the constant shadow of Egyptian power, unable to imagine life beyond their chains. Generations grew up knowing nothing but servitude. Hope itself felt fragile, as though it might vanish if spoken aloud. The promise given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob seemed like a distant dream, almost swallowed by the daily reality of oppression. Yet in the silence, in the weight of unrelenting hardship, faith still flickered. Their longing for deliverance was a form of faith, for every cry lifted to heaven testified to their trust that the God of their fathers still reigned, even if unseen. The suffering of Israel is more than an ancient memory. It reflects the condition of countless lives across history. The bondage of Egypt becomes a mirror for all who find themselves under burdens too heavy to bear. It may be the weight of injustice, the sting of loss, or the chains of fear and despair. The story reminds us that the cries of the oppressed do not vanish into the air but are heard by the one who sees every tear. Psalm 34 verse 17 declares, "The righteous cry out, and the Lord hears them. He delivers them from all their troubles." Even when answers seem delayed, the hearing of God is certain. Waiting under bondage is one of the hardest trials, for time feels like an enemy and silence feels like abandonment. The Israelites surely wondered why God had not acted sooner, why generation after generation had passed with no sign of freedom. Yet what seemed like delay was preparation. God was setting the stage for a deliverance so mighty that no one could deny his power. In the waiting, he was shaping their hearts, teaching them to long for him, and preparing them to recognize that the freedom they sought would come not by their own strength but by his hand. The cries of bondage carry a weight of desperation, but also a depth of faith. To cry out is to believe that someone is listening. To lift one's voice in pain is to hope that change is possible. The Israelites may not have understood how or when, but their cries were seeds of trust planted in the soil of suffering. Those cries became the spark that stirred heaven's plan into action, for God does not remain unmoved by the cries of his people. In reflecting on the cries of Israel, one can see the deep connection between human weakness and divine strength. The greater the burden, the more glorious the deliverance. The longer the night, the brighter the dawn when it finally breaks. The Red Sea miracle cannot be understood apart from the cries that preceded it, for the miracle was not simply a display of God's power. It was his answer to the prayers that had risen for generations. The story reminds every listener that waiting on God is not wasted time. In the silence of bondage, his plan was unfolding. In the weariness of slavery, his covenant remained firm. The cries of bondage were the beginning of deliverance, for they reached the ear of the Almighty. And from those cries would rise the story of redemption that has inspired faith for thousands of years. In the midst of Israel's suffering, God raised up an unlikely figure who would become the instrument of their deliverance. His name was Moses, and his story begins not with strength, but with vulnerability. As a child, his life was threatened by Pharaoh's decree that every Hebrew boy should be thrown into the Nile. Yet through the courage of his mother and the providence of God, Moses was placed in a basket upon the waters, rescued by Pharaoh's daughter, and raised in the very household of the king who had sought his death. His beginnings reveal a theme that runs throughout the story of salvation, that God often works through unexpected means and preserves lives for purposes not yet revealed. Moses grew up with the education and privileges of the Egyptian court. Yet he never lost his identity as a Hebrew. When he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave, his compassion stirred, and in his anger he struck down the Egyptian. Fearing discovery, Moses fled into the wilderness, far from the power of Pharaoh and far from the cries of his people. He became a shepherd in Midian, a man seemingly set aside, forgotten by Egypt and perhaps even forgotten by his own people. For decades, Moses lived in obscurity, tending sheep rather than leading nations. It was in that wilderness that God chose to reveal himself. On a mountain, Moses saw a bush burning yet not consumed, and from the flames came a voice that called his name. The ground was declared holy, and Moses was told to remove his sandals, for he stood before the presence of the Almighty. God spoke to him, revealing his concern for the suffering of his people and his plan to deliver them from Egypt. He declared that he would send Moses to Pharaoh, to demand the release of the Israelites and to lead them into the land promised to their fathers. Moses, however, was not eager to accept this call. He felt unworthy, uncertain, and overwhelmed. His questions tumbled forth. Who am I to go to Pharaoh? What if they do not believe me? How can I speak when my tongue is slow? His hesitations reveal the frailty of human confidence. Yet God answered each objection, promising his presence, granting signs, and assuring Moses that he would provide the words. In this encounter, one sees the pattern of God's calling, that he does not choose the most eloquent or the most powerful by worldly measures, but those willing to lean on his strength. The call of Moses reveals a deeper truth, that deliverance is not the work of human ability alone, but of divine empowerment. The bush burned without being consumed, symbolizing the fire of God's presence that sustains without destroying. In the same way, Moses would carry out his mission not by his own power, but by the fire of God's Spirit working through him. His weakness became the very place where God's strength could be displayed. For the Israelites, the rise of Moses was the answer to their cries. For Moses, it was the unfolding of a destiny he could never have planned. The shepherd in the wilderness became the chosen leader of a nation, the mouthpiece of God before kings, and the guide of a people toward freedom. His story demonstrates that God raises deliverers in his own time, often from unexpected places, and equips them for tasks far beyond what they imagine. The encounter at the burning bush also carried a revelation of God's name. When Moses asked whom he should say had sent him, God declared, "I am who I am," in Exodus chapter 3, verse 14. This name revealed his eternal presence, his unchanging nature, and his authority over all creation. It was not Moses' name that would command Pharaoh's attention, but the name of the one who is above all. The rising of a deliverer was not only for Israel's freedom, but also for the revelation of God's character. Through Moses, the people would see that God is both compassionate and powerful, both near to hear their cries and mighty to act on their behalf. The story of Moses' calling shows that God prepares his chosen instruments, often in seasons of hiddenness, and then reveals them in the fullness of his timing. Moses' journey from the Nile to the wilderness to the burning bush stands as a testimony that God's plans are never hindered by human weakness or delay. The one who fled Egypt in fear would return in faith, carrying not his own authority, but the authority of the Almighty. This was the beginning of a confrontation that would shake Egypt and reveal the sovereignty of God over the might of kings. The call of Moses led directly to a confrontation unlike any other in history, a clash between human pride and divine authority. Armed not with weapons, but with the command of God, Moses returned to Egypt and stood before Pharaoh, declaring the words that would echo through time, "Let my people go." Pharaoh, who viewed himself as a god upon earth, responded with defiance. His heart was hardened, his pride unyielding, and he refused to release the slaves who had built his cities and served his empire. What followed was a series of plagues that struck at the very heart of Egypt's power. The Nile, which the Egyptians revered as the source of life, was turned into blood. Frogs swarmed the land, gnats and flies filled their homes, livestock died, boils broke out on the people, hail destroyed the crops, locusts devoured what remained, and darkness covered the land. Each plague was more than a natural disaster. It was a direct challenge to the gods of Egypt, revealing that the Lord of Israel was supreme over all. The plagues revealed not only God's power, but also Pharaoh's stubbornness. Time and again, when relief came, Pharaoh hardened his heart and refused to let the people go. His resistance mirrors the struggle of the human heart against surrender, the refusal to yield control, even when confronted with the truth of God's authority. Pharaoh clung to his power, but with each refusal the weight of judgment grew heavier. For the Israelites, the plagues were both terrifying and reassuring. They saw the devastation around them, yet they were spared from many of the afflictions. In the land of Goshen, where they dwelled, the distinction was clear, as if God had drawn a line to show that his people were under his care. The plagues became signs not only of God's judgment on Egypt, but also of his protection over Israel. The clash with Pharaoh was not only political or physical, it was deeply spiritual. It revealed the contest between the pride of man and the sovereignty of God. The might of Egypt, with its armies, temples, and wealth, was brought low by the command of the God who spoke through a shepherd. The power structures of the world were shaken by the voice of the one who reigns above all. Pharaoh's hardened heart serves as a warning to every generation. Repeatedly confronted with truth, he chose defiance. Repeatedly offered a chance to surrender, he chose pride. His example shows how a heart that resists God grows harder with each refusal, until even the clearest signs cannot move it. In contrast, the story calls us to yield when God speaks, to recognize that true freedom comes not from clinging to control, but from surrendering to his will. Moses, once hesitant and fearful, now stood with boldness before Pharaoh. The one who had questioned his ability to speak became the messenger of divine power. This transformation revealed that when God calls and equips, no obstacle is too great, no king too mighty, no empire too strong to resist his plan. The confrontation was not about Moses' strength, but about the authority of the one who sent him. The plagues reached their climax with the coming of the final judgment, a night that would change Egypt forever. Pharaoh's resistance had led to the brink of devastation, and God's justice would soon be revealed in its fullness. The clash between Pharaoh and God was drawing to its most solemn moment, where the line between judgment and deliverance would be marked by the blood of a lamb. As the confrontation with Pharaoh reached its climax, God declared that a final judgment would fall upon Egypt, a judgment that would touch every household. Death would pass through the land, striking down the firstborn of man and beast. It was a night of dread for Egypt, but for Israel it became the night of deliverance, for God provided a way of protection through the blood of the Lamb. Each household was commanded to take a lamb without blemish, to sacrifice it, and to place its blood upon the doorposts and lintels of their homes. The lamb was to be eaten, roasted with fire, and shared among the family. That night, as death passed through Egypt, the homes marked by the blood were spared. The judgment that fell on the land did not touch those who obeyed the command and trusted in the sign of the Lamb's blood. This night became known as the Passover, a memorial for generations to come. It was a night that revealed both the justice and the mercy of God. Justice fell upon Egypt for its oppression, but mercy covered Israel under the blood. The Lamb became the substitute, its blood standing as a shield against judgment. The symbolism of this night would echo far into the future, pointing toward the ultimate Lamb who would take away the sins of the world. The Israelites prepared in haste, ready to depart at a moment's notice. Their bread was unleavened, for there was no time for it to rise. Their sandals were on their feet, their staffs in their hands. It was the posture of a people about to be set free. The bondage of centuries was about to be broken in a single night, and their departure would be swift. For the Egyptians, the night was one of anguish. The cry that rose from Egypt was unlike any before, for death visited every household, from the palace of Pharaoh to the home of the prisoner. The gods of Egypt could not save them. Their power was shattered, and their land was brought to its knees. Pharaoh, who had defied the God of Israel, was now broken by the weight of judgment. The final night of deliverance was not only about freedom from slavery, but also about redemption. The Israelites were not spared because of their strength or merit, but because of the blood that covered them. This truth echoes through the generations, that salvation is the work of God, given through His provision and received by faith. Obedience was central to this night. Every family that followed the instructions was protected. Every detail mattered, for the blood on the door was the sign that distinguished life from death. In this way, the Passover became a lesson in trust, teaching the people that deliverance comes through faith in God's word and in His appointed means of salvation. The cost of freedom was marked in blood. Egypt paid the price of defiance, and Israel was covered by the blood of the Lamb. The story reminds us that freedom is never cheap. It comes with sacrifice. For Israel, it was the Lamb. For the future, it would point to a greater sacrifice yet to come. That night, as the people gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, they were not only stepping out of Egypt, but stepping into a new identity. They were no longer slaves, but a redeemed people, chosen and set apart. The final night of deliverance was both an end and a beginning, the closing of the chapter of bondage and the opening of the journey toward the promise. The Passover became a memorial, celebrated year after year, to remind Israel of the God who delivered them with a mighty hand. Each retelling carried the weight of that night, keeping alive the memory of the blood, the cry, the haste, and the freedom. It was not simply history, it was a living testimony that the God who passed over His people is faithful to deliver. When the Israelites departed from Egypt, their hearts were filled with relief and amazement. They had seen with their own eyes the power of God displayed in the plagues, and they had walked out of the land of their bondage with Pharaoh's command ringing behind them to leave at once. After centuries of slavery, they were finally free. They carried with them the treasures of Egypt, given by their former oppressors in haste, and they set out with joy, guided by the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. Yet freedom, though granted, was quickly tested. As the people journeyed, Pharaoh's heart turned once again to defiance. The weight of Egypt's loss, the emptiness of its labor force, and the humiliation of defeat gnawed at him. His pride could not bear the thought that a nation of slaves had walked out under the command of their God. Pharaoh gathered his chariots, his officers, and the might of Egypt's army, and he pursued the Israelites with fury. What had begun as deliverance now turned into a race for survival, as the freed slaves found themselves pursued by the most powerful military force of their time. The Israelites soon found themselves hemmed in, with the sea before them and Pharaoh's army pressing behind. Fear gripped their hearts as they saw the dust rising in the distance, the glint of armor, the thunder of hooves. Their cries of desperation rose to Moses, voices trembling with panic. They said it would have been better to serve in Egypt than to die in the wilderness. In that moment, the taste of freedom was overshadowed by the looming threat of destruction, and their faith faltered under the weight of fear. Moses, however, spoke with a calm born of trust in the one who had called him. He told the people not to be afraid, but to stand firm and witness the salvation of the Lord. Exodus chapter 14 verse 14 records his words, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." In that assurance, the clash between fear and faith became clear. The The Israelites looked to their circumstances and saw death, but Moses looked to God and saw deliverance. The pursuit of Pharaoh's army reveals a deep truth about the journey of faith. Freedom is not without opposition, and deliverance is often followed by trials that test the heart. When the enemy seems to close in and options appear exhausted, the temptation to return to the familiar, even to the bondage once despised, grows strong. Yet it is in these moments that faith must rise, not in human strength, but in the promise of God's power to save. The people's cries of fear echo the struggles of every generation. When obstacles appear insurmountable and threats seem overwhelming, it is easy to believe that hope has ended. Yet the voice of God speaks through Moses' words, reminding all who fear that the battle belongs to him. What the Israelites could not see was that their moment of desperation was the stage for one of the greatest miracles ever recorded. Pharaoh's pursuit was fierce, but it was also futile, for no army can prevail against the purposes of God. What seemed to Israel like certain destruction was, in truth, the pathway to their greatest deliverance. God had led them to the sea not to abandon them, but to reveal his glory in a way that would silence their enemies forever. The dust of Pharaoh's chariots and the terror in the people's hearts would soon give way to awe and victory as God unfolded his plan. The pursuit of Pharaoh's army stands as a reminder that moments of fear are often preludes to miracles. The louder the footsteps of the enemy, the closer the deliverance of God may be. In the darkest hour, when the sea blocks the way forward and the enemy presses behind, the Lord prepares to open a path no eye has seen. The sea stretched before the Israelites like an endless barrier. Its waters rose and fell with the rhythm of waves, vast and unyielding, an impossible obstacle to a people with no boats, no escape. Behind them, the roar of Pharaoh's army drew nearer. It was in this moment that God spoke to Moses, commanding him to stretch out his hand over the sea. With the staff lifted, the wind began to blow, fierce and unrelenting, driving back the waters and dividing them. What had moments earlier seemed impenetrable now opened into a path through the deep. The sight must have been overwhelming. Walls of water rose on either side, towering over the people, yet held back by the invisible hand of God. The seabed, once hidden beneath waves, became dry ground. The way of escape was not through human ingenuity or effort, but through a miracle that defied every natural expectation. The Israelites, who had trembled moments before, now stepped forward into the impossible, walking through the heart of the sea on a path made by God alone. Each step was a testimony of faith. To walk between walls of water required trust, for at any moment it could seem that the sea might return to its place, yet the people moved forward, guided by the pillar of fire and cloud that stood between them and the Egyptian army. What had been fear became wonder. What had been despair became hope, as they experienced firsthand the mighty deliverance of the Lord. The parting of the sea reveals the nature of God's power. He is not bound by natural laws, nor limited by human imagination. When every option appears closed, he creates a way where none exists. Isaiah chapter 43 verse 16 recalls this moment with these words, "This is what the Lord says, He who made a way through the sea, a path through the mighty waters." The miracle was more than escape. It was a revelation of God's sovereignty over creation itself. The experience of the Israelites in the sea also speaks to the journey of faith. The path may not always be broad or comfortable, but it is sufficient, for it is made by God. The walls of water on either side were both terrifying and protective. What could have destroyed them now shielded them, standing as a barrier against the enemy. In the same way, God can take what threatens his people and transform it into their safeguard. Behind them, the Egyptians pursued with boldness, entering the sea as if they could claim the same path. But the path was not theirs, for it was opened by God for his people alone. The arrogance of Pharaoh's army led them into the very place where their defeat would be sealed. What Israel walked through in faith, Egypt pursued in pride, and the difference would determine the outcome. The passage through the sea is remembered as the great turning point in Israel's history. It was the moment when the nation stepped out of slavery and into freedom, not by negotiation or rebellion, but by divine intervention. The walls of water bore witness to the power of the God who fights for his people, who opens a way where no way can be seen, and who turns despair into deliverance. For all who hear this story, the image of the sea parted stands as a symbol of hope. It reminds us that no obstacle is too great, no barrier too strong, no situation too impossible for God to overcome. The path through the deep was not only for Israel then, it is a testimony for all generations that the Lord is the one who makes a way through the impossible. When the last of the Israelites had crossed the sea and stood safely on the other side, the moment of deliverance reached its climax. The Egyptians, in pursuit, pressed into the path, their chariots rattling, their horses charging. Yet the God who had opened the way now acted to close it. Moses stretched out his hand once more, and the waters that had stood as walls now came crashing back into their place. The sea, once a pathway, became a grave for Pharaoh's army. Chariots, riders, and soldiers were swept away, their pride and power swallowed by the depths. The people of Israel stood on the shore, watching the waters return, and they saw their oppressors no more. The army that had once struck fear into their hearts was gone, destroyed not by their own hands, but by the power of their God. In that moment, fear gave way to awe, and despair gave way to victory. They had not only escaped slavery, but had seen their enemy defeated before their eyes. The memory of chains would remain, but the threat of Egypt's power was ended. The response of the people was not silence, but song. Moses and the Israelites lifted their voices in praise, declaring the greatness of their God. Exodus chapter 15 begins with their words, "I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea." Their song was not just celebration, it was worship. It proclaimed the victory of God, the majesty of his power, and the faithfulness of his promise. Miriam, the sister of Moses, took a tambourine in her hand, and the women joined her with dancing and rejoicing. The song spread from the leaders to the people, from the men to the women, until the shore that had echoed with cries of fear now resounded with songs of triumph. Music and dance became the natural response to the miracle they had witnessed, for gratitude demanded expression. The triumph at the sea was more than a military victory. It was a revelation of God's character. The people declared him their strength, their defense, their salvation. They recognized that it was his right hand that shattered the enemy, his breath that piled up the waters, his unfailing love that led them to freedom. The song became a confession of faith, a proclamation that the God who delivered them was their God forever. This moment teaches the power of remembering. The Israelites could never forget what they had seen, for the sea itself had testified to the greatness of their God. Their song preserved the memory, passing it to future generations, so that children yet unborn would know the story of the God who saves. Psalm 106 verse 12 reflects on this moment, saying, "Then they believed his promises and sang his praise." Faith and song were intertwined, for gratitude strengthens trust. The triumph and the song also reveal the importance of worship in the life of faith. Deliverance is not complete until it is acknowledged with praise. To sing is to declare that the victory is not our own, but belongs to the Lord. To worship is to turn the heart from fear to gratitude, from self to God. The song of Moses and Miriam remains a pattern for all who experience God's saving power, a call to lift voices in thanksgiving and awe. Standing on the other side of the sea, Israel was not only free, but also redefined. They were no longer slaves, but a people of covenant, delivered by the hand of the Almighty, called to walk with him in faith. Their song marked the beginning of a new identity, one shaped not by chains, but by the memory of redemption. The crossing of the Red Sea was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new chapter in Israel's journey. With their enemies destroyed and the sea behind them, the people now faced the vast wilderness that stretched before them. The miracle had delivered them from bondage, but the road ahead would test their faith in new ways. Freedom is not only a release from the past, but also a call to trust in the present and future. The lesson of the sea was clear. God is able to make a way where none exists. Yet the wilderness would teach the people whether they truly believed that lesson. Their journey would not be without challenges, for hunger, thirst, and weariness awaited them. The memory of chains was gone, but the need for daily dependence on God was only beginning. The Red Sea was a decisive act of deliverance, but it was also a foundation for ongoing faith. The people were called to walk not by sight, but by trust. They could no longer measure life by the strength of Egypt or the fear of Pharaoh, for those had been defeated. They had to learn to measure life by the presence of the God who guided them. The pillar of cloud and fire continued to lead them, reminding them that their future was in his hands. Each step into the wilderness was a step of faith, sustained not by their own strength, but by his provision. The lessons of the Red Sea are not confined to ancient history. They speak to the journey of every believer. Life often presents wilderness seasons, where the path ahead is uncertain and the past seems safer in memory. Yet the story teaches that the God who parted the waters is the same God who guides in the wilderness. His deliverance is not a single act, but a continual presence. Gratitude was meant to be the companion of the journey. The song of triumph was not only for the moment, but for the road ahead. Remembering what God has done strengthens faith for what he will do. Forgetfulness, on the other hand, leads to fear and doubt. The people were called to carry the memory of the sea with them, to let it shape their trust in every trial that followed. The Red Sea also teaches that deliverance brings responsibility. Israel was free, but freedom was not license. They were called to be a holy people, set apart for God's purposes, walking in obedience to his commands. The journey ahead was not only about reaching the promised land, but about becoming the people God intended them to be. Every wilderness step tested their hearts. Would they trust when food was scarce, when water was lacking, when enemies appeared on the horizon? The lessons of the sea were meant to anchor their faith, reminding them that the God who had split the waters could surely provide bread from heaven and water from the rock. Each challenge was an opportunity to remember, to believe, and to follow. The journey ahead was long, and the path often difficult, but the Red Sea stood behind them as a monument of God's power and faithfulness. It was a story they could return to in every trial, a testimony that the impossible had been made possible by the hand of their God. For them, and for all who hear the story today, the lesson remains. The God who delivers is the God who leads, and the path he opens is the path that sustains. The story of the Red Sea miracle is not confined to the pages of ancient history. Though the waves that parted have long since closed, the message of this event continues to speak into the lives of people today. Each person faces moments that feel like standing at the shore of that sea, with obstacles before them and enemies behind them, with no visible way forward. These are the moments when hope seems lost, when the heart trembles with fear, and when the mind cannot imagine a solution. It is in such times that the Red Sea story reminds us that God opens paths where none can be seen. The Red Sea represents the impossible situations of life, the barriers that stand between us and freedom, between us and peace, between us and the fulfillment of what God has promised. For some, it may be a struggle with despair or anxiety. For others, a battle with broken relationships, financial hardship, or deep loss. Whatever form it takes, the sea looms large and unyielding. Yet the story declares that the same God who parted the waters for Israel still works in the lives of his people today, creating ways through the depths of difficulty. These moments are often accompanied by fear, just as the Israelites feared the army of Pharaoh. The natural response to fear is to retreat, to long for what is familiar, even if it means returning to chains. But the Red Sea reminds us that freedom is ahead, not behind, and that faith requires stepping forward into the unknown, trusting that God is able to sustain us even when circumstances look overwhelming. The miracle calls each person to courage, to believe that no obstacle is greater than the power of the one who leads them. The imagery of walking through the sea on dry ground speaks directly to the life of faith. The path may not be wide, it may not be comfortable, but it is enough, because it is opened by God. Just as Israel had to take each step between the walls of water, so too we are called to take steps of faith in situations that feel fragile or uncertain. Every step testifies to trust. Every step affirms that God is greater than the waves. The destruction of Pharaoh's army also carries a message for today. The enemies that once held Israel captive were defeated not by their own strength, but by the power of God. In the same way, the forces that enslave hearts and minds, whether fear, guilt, or despair, can be overcome not by human effort alone, but by the deliverance that comes from above. The Red Sea is a picture of victory, a declaration that the forces which once pursued us can be silenced forever by the power of God's hand. The song of triumph that followed reminds us of the importance of gratitude. When deliverance comes, when the sea closes behind us and the path lies open ahead, the natural response is to lift our voices in thanksgiving. Worship is not simply an act of ritual. It is the recognition of what God has done. To sing, to give thanks, to rejoice, is to proclaim that the victory is not ours, but His. Gratitude transforms memory into faith, carrying the testimony of the past into the challenges of the future. For believers today, the Red Sea miracle is both a comfort and a call. It comforts by reminding us that no situation is beyond God's reach, that His power is greater than the waves that rise against us. It calls us to trust, to walk forward in faith even when the way is hidden, to remember that the God who parted the sea is the same yesterday, today, and forever. The story is not only about deliverance long ago, it is about the continual work of God in the lives of all who look to Him. Every Red Sea moment we face becomes an opportunity for faith. When the path is blocked and fear presses in, we are invited to stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, just as Moses declared. The same God who made a path through the deep still leads His people today, still delivers from bondage, still brings hope out of despair, still creates freedom where none seems possible. The story lives on because its truth is eternal. God makes a way through the depths. The miracle of the Red Sea is more than an ancient account. It is a living testimony of hope, freedom, and divine power that speaks into our lives even now. May its message remind you that no sea is too deep, no obstacle too great, and no enemy too strong when the Lord fights for His people. If this message has touched your heart, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel so you never miss future reflections like this one. Remember to like this video to help spread its reach, leave a comment below to share your thoughts or personal experiences, and most importantly, share this video with your family and friends so that they too may be encouraged by the story of the Red Sea miracle. Together, let us keep the message alive that God still makes a way through the deep.